quick idea of our agenda, our running order. We have Michael S. is going to kick it off for us with a fairly straightforward, I think, but incredibly useful process about posting to a chatter group when you receive a donation over a particular amount. And I'm very grateful for that Michael's joined us, because he's run a lot of circles of success on ProcessBuilder. So I'm sure you'll get a great explanation out of him. Scott, fingers crossed that he's coming back in, is going to talk about how you can vary the templates that you use for acknowledgements when you receive a donation. Michael K is, I think you want to talk about some automatic naming conventions, and also an index field that it prevents duplicates on a custom object, which sounds really interesting. And we also, if we have time, I think we also have a list of sort of common gotchas, things that might go wrong with your process builder, and to help you to do a bit of troubleshooting. So plenty to talk about. Let's hope that as things calm down and we get into the hour, that Scott can get back in. Otherwise, so we'll keep working on that. As I say, if you have questions, please post them in the chat first. Otherwise, quite enough from me, and I'm going to hand over to Michael S.
Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah.
Okay, are you seeing my screen?
We are seeing your screen. Thank you very much. Oh yes, awesome. I see me. There we go.
Let's put that down here. Okay. So yeah, as Caroline mentioned, I have done quite a number of co-presentations. A while back, we used to do with my colleague Margaret Faco, and I used to do presentations of circles of success on automation. And one of those that we did a number of times is basically the idea is to post to a chatter group when a donation comes in that's posted and that's over a certain amount. And so I'm just going to dive right on in. I'm in a trial org that has NPSP. I'm going to go to ProcessBuilder. And I'm going to create a new process. Give it a name, post to chatter over, let's say $1,000. Oops, typos. Public typing, my favorite thing. And descriptions are always good. I recommend them. For this, it's very simple. So we're just going to have it fire when a record changes. And of course, the first thing you have to do when you're setting up ProcessBuilder is choose the object that you're going to have the automation act on. And the way I like to think about this is, what thing will your users be interacting with, meaning literally editing and saving, or creating and saving, such that you want a robot to do a thing. And in our case, we're going to be using the opportunity object. And it's telling me, oh, you already have an active record change process. So this is interesting. I didn't think that would happen, but this is good, because what it's telling you is you already have some automation in place on this object. Do you want to just add automation to that existing, add functionality to that existing automation, or do you want to create a new one? And it's best practice to keep them all in one place. So I'm actually going to go ahead and do that, because that's best practice. So I'm going to go view all processes, and where's one? Here it is. So for the purposes of this, I'm not going to bother talking through what this thing does. I'm just going to deactivate this for right now. And then I'll go back into new. Let's see here. What did I do? There we go. I'll go back into the one I was creating. Okay, so we're going to grab opportunity. And in this case, I'm going to say start the process when a record is created or edited, because we could have opportunities that aren't posted yet, or whether the amount changes or something like that. And that's all I'm going to do here. And then I'm going to add criteria. Criteria is, what are the conditions under which you want this automation to fire? And we said it was going to be $1,000 or more, and post it. And now you have some options to choose conditions, which is probably the easiest to work with, formula, or you can say no criteria at all, just always do this thing. We're going to use conditions rather, and I'm going to use this field picker to get into my list of opportunity fields, and we'll choose the amount field first. And all I'm doing here is selecting the field. So I choose it. Now I say, how do I want to evaluate it? I want to say greater than or equal 1,000. And now I have an additional condition, and that's, of course, that I want the stage to be posted. So I'm going to find my stage field. And in this case, it knows it's a pick list, so I can just scroll and find the one I want. And I'm not seeing what I want because this thing's in the way. There's posted. Okay. You have the option beneath here to say, do you want to do it when both of these things happened, or put in some logic? In this case, we're gonna use it the default action of, or the default option rather, of when both of these things are true. I am going to click into this advanced box. This is an option that you have to only execute the actions when these changes have been made to the record. And there's some more information here that says when you select yes, the actions are executed only if the record meets the criteria now, but the values that the record had immediately before it was saved didn't meet the criteria. This means that these actions won't be executed when irrelevant changes are made. And I'm actually going to check this box because I don't want to post to chatter more than the first time these conditions are met.
Do you almost always
So I'm going to save that.
Do you almost always check that box, Michael? It's interesting, isn't it? Because I always have a little debate about whether I should be checking it or not. In most cases, do you?
That's a great question. I feel like in most cases I do, but there certainly are instances where you wouldn't. For example, we have some automation that builds the name of a record by concatenating values of other fields. And in that case, you might want that one to fire all the time. So it's worth thinking about.
That's a good thought, isn't it? And sometimes it doesn't like it. If you have an is changed or is new or something, I think formula, sometimes it doesn't want you to check the box, I think. But yeah.
That's true. That's true.
But it's a good one, and it's very easy to miss, isn't it? But it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, you have to click the little arrow to expose that little advanced option. Definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah.
And I think if I remember right, if you don't check that, you can't do time-based.
That's exactly right. Let me just quickly show that. So if I go back into the criteria, what Michael's talking about is this scheduled action area over here. If you don't have this advanced checkbox chosen, that isn't an option. You can only execute things immediately.
I had not seen that before. Thank you, Michael.
I'm going to turn this back on, not because I want to do a scheduled action, although they're pretty cool, but because I only want my action to happen when the record meets those criteria the first time.
And you're getting
so now I'm going to add an action.
Somebody else who's just a comment going, oh my God, I'd never seen that before as well. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to add action now. And one thing that's really amazing about ProcessBuilder, especially if you're getting into it coming from the olden days of workflow, is the number of different actions that you have available in ProcessBuilder. There are tons. In our case, the one we're going to choose is post to chatter. There's a lot of other ones here. They're fairly straightforward with a couple of exceptions. Obviously, you can call Apex. That's pretty involved. And some other things. I'm not going to talk through all those. We're just going to go right to post to chatter. And when you choose the post to chatter action, obviously you have to give it a name. Donation, oopsie. Wow, public typing, again, my favorite thing. Okay, when you post to chatter or use this action type, you have some options of how to post. And you can post to a specific user, you can post to a chatter group, or you can post to the record. And I'm actually going to choose this record. I would add, though, that I am going to mention a chatter group. And it's important to note that if you're going to do something like this, you have to have created that chatter group already, which I did, and you'll see what I mean by that. So you can basically craft your message that will essentially be the text of the post using merge fields if you want. We were going to do a little bit of that. So gift posted, whoops, on, and we'll merge in the close date. And I'm going to close in the amount. Are you guys still hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, I just got a notification in my headphones that my headset batteries are dying, so I'm going to go a little fast here. And then I'm going to add in, and all you have to do to do an @mention is just type the @ sign, and then start typing either the name of a person or a group, and save. The last thing to do, obviously, is to activate your process. If you don't do that, it's not going to do anything. So I'm going to go ahead and activate. And when you activate a process, it tells you that this is going to automatically activate any other version of this process that you may have. And that's okay, because there aren't any. Okay, time to test. So I'm going to go to, go ahead, Michael.
While you're going to your record, I just want to note for everyone, chatter groups, whether you're mentioning them or if you had used the post to a group option, either way, it is effectively a hard-coded record ID for the chatter group. So if you build your process in a sandbox and then you deploy it, trying to post to a chatter group that's supposed to exist in both, you will need to clone your process and rebuild that node to point to the correct group inside your org.
That's a really good point.
Fabulous, gotcha. Thank you, Michael.
So I tend, when I'm building processes in sandboxes that are going to do that, I actually make myself a to-do item. After deployment, you need to edit the process before you activate it to make it work in production.
Great
Yep,
tip.
really good point. Okay, let's give this thing a whirl. We're going to click into new donation. We're going to use the stage of posted. I'm going to set the amount to $1,000, and we're going to click save and cross our fingers. And if I go over to this chatter group, oh my gosh, look at that.
Woohoo! Perfect. That's really good. So I'm great, perfect, and I can see you've done it a few times before. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe.
Just maybe. All right. Now that's great. We have a couple of interesting questions that have come in. I don't know. I'm going to read them back, and you can let me know, Michaels, whether you want to tackle them now or whether we leave them until for a little later on. There is one from Sandy, which is about he's looking to move a workflow rule that has time-based notifications into ProcessBuilder and wants to ensure if he's setting it up correctly. Do you know have you got any tips or tricks or whatever about doing time-based processes? And then we have another one about debugging. Maybe let's do the time-based one, then we might go on to Scott, and we might come back to debugging later, because I think that's a really interesting question. It might fit in with what we were going to talk about later. So,
sure. So
the scheduled ones or the time-based ones? What would you
I
like
mean,
to
my
share
thought
about those?
on how to answer. I guess what I would do is I'll clone this real quick and just kind of click into that area of the action. The main thing that's different about a scheduled action versus an immediate action is you have to set a schedule, and that's the first thing you have to do. And just like in workflow, I believe you have the option for number of days or hours before or after a date. And the thing to know is that the date, it has to be a field on the record that, or sorry, a field on the object that your process is starting on. Other than that, it's fairly straightforward. So if I say I want the post to happen 1 hour after the, if I had a field here for posted date, there it is. And then save that, then you add actions underneath it. So that's where I would put in my post to chatter or whatever. This is kind of a weird use case. You wouldn't do that probably, but other than that, it's fairly straightforward. You can add, once you add one action, you can add another one, but you can't add an additional action until you have one. That kind of makes sense. So it's fairly it's fairly similar to workflow, time-based workflow, but it just looks a little different. Michael K., would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was actually just noting, by the way, that you can choose 0 hours after, or 0 days, I suppose, which can be used to control that essentially you're setting an action that will only fire after this process has run, because I've run into things where I set my action with an immediate action, and then a later node in the process does something to the record, and that later node hasn't fired yet when the immediate action has fired. So
that's fancy.
The trick you can use to ensure that it will be, 1 to 3 minutes after the saving of this record.
This is Scott. If I could add something on scheduled actions.
Yeah.
I'm here.
Hooray!
One thing about scheduled actions is that there is sort of a complicated, there are different ways that it will react to changes in the trigger condition if it hasn't fired yet. So just the example that I use, because this ended up being kind of a big mess, is sending out renewal emails. Like someone's membership is coming due. Like, okay, well, 30 days before the close date, we want to send out a reminder email. And if the node, and if it is a process that runs on creation or edit, it will check back and make sure that opportunity is not closed before it sends that email. But if you've edited and thus activated a new version of the process, it won't check back, and that email will go out anyways, which can create, and has created, kind of big messes in trying to figure things out. So sometimes the time-based actions will check back and it works to your advantage. But if for some reason you need to make a change to the process, you can erase that check back and it'll just go out anyways and make you look bad. So it's something to think about. You need to kind of plan out your scheduled actions if you hope that they will check back on the initial conditions before firing, if that makes sense.
Hey guys, this is Sandy jumping in and asking the original question. Thank you for taking this on. And that's exactly what I was concerned about. So when you're first setting up your opportunity, you get that choice of whether to fire the process immediately or anytime it's edited. And my understanding was that if you do immediately, then you have the ability to do scheduled actions. But you've just shown me something slightly different there in the criteria. By clicking the box for the advanced, then you can go into it. So my concern is notifications go out based off of the end date upon creation. But what if a month later somebody goes into that opportunity and edits that close date? How is the process builder going to account for that? Like, what's the logic that makes that safe?
According to the documentation, and I haven't checked this, it will always adjust for that. Even if the process has been deactivated, it will always adjust your timing based on the edited close date. But I know that only from documentation and not from hard-earned experience.
Okay, so in my particular use case, it sounds like I'd be safe when an opportunity is created, send the notifications based off of the close date, rather than when the opportunity is created and edited to meet the criteria. I think it's a pretty straight ahead thing. Okay, cool. I think you guys have helped me out. Thank you.
Of course we have, Sandy. We always try to. The one thing I'd noticed that's interesting is, have any of you come across this before, is when you put in a scheduled action, you have to stop the process there, don't you? You're not allowed to change it to make it go to the next step. Is that?
That is true.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing, I guess, and what I was looking at in quite a complex process that I was looking at the other day is I felt like, well, the timed action is going to have to then be the last step, because normally you would be able to evaluate the next thing, wouldn't you? But I believe once you put in a scheduled action, that's it. That has to be the last action.
Yeah, I'd need to add another set of criteria here to show that. I can do that, or I can pass off to somebody else.
Shall I leave you just to test with it? I mean, it's interesting. It is one of the things that I was finding is with a scheduled action, you couldn't. Yes, let's carry on. Thank you for answering Bob's question, Michael. And let's Scott. We're all keeping our fingers crossed because Scott had to log in again, but hopefully he's here this time and I can make him the presenter. Message coming your way, Scott, and we'll come back to we can have another think about scheduled actions, and Maida, we will come back to your debugging question later. All right, it still says waiting to see your screen, Scott. Yay, there we go.
Okay.
Brilliant.
So I'm not actually gonna try to type in public. I'm just gonna kind of show you around something that seems to come up on the hub fairly often, in that people want to use different acknowledgement emails for different types of GIFs. People often ask about this, and while I did this, I worked through this about, I guess, 2.5 years ago. I think it's all still valid, but it's just showing how to use ProcessBuilder instead of workflow rule to allow you to have different thank you notes for different kinds of donations. And I will, when I'm done talking, I'll try to remember to paste this in the chat window if people want to go back and find these instructions. So the way that NPSP is set up to send the acknowledgements is through a workflow rule called Opportunity Email Acknowledgement. And it uses this formula, this rule criteria, to check that they're not deceased, that they have not said do not contact. Sorry, I've got a window covering some of it. There it went. These various routine checks to see if it should send out a thank you note when it's closed. But it will only send out the one. So instead of doing that, what I set up was actually sort of a multi-step process builder, 2 process builder processes to do that instead of using the workflow rule. And so what I have done, and I think this, I think it was said before that the best practice is to try to keep all of one object's processes on a single process builder process. And I can maybe argue later about why I did it differently in this case. I've got one thing set up to be the recipient of all of the opportunity processes, but I set up a separate invocable process builder process to decide which email template to send. Before starting this, you need to have those emails set up before you do the process builder and know what criteria you want to use. For this case, I just use the opportunity record type to decide. So looking first at the process that actually decides and sends the email. It is a two-step process. And it is an invocable process based on the opportunity. Let me go. Sorry, I switched to another device, and the keyboard I use all the time is now totally unhelpful. So when you hear me pausing, it's because I'm using the wrong devices. It is an opportunity process. It is based on the opportunity, but it starts when another process invokes it. So the other process that we'll look at in a little bit, we'll call this process, and we'll send it an opportunity to work its magic with. And this process is pretty simple. The criteria, if we look at the criteria node here, it has one criteria: is this opportunity record type name equal to donation? And if it's true, well, it sends a donation email. When setting up this immediate action, you say that what you want to do is have the action send an email. You pick an email alert, you give it a name, and you save it, and you're good to go. And then the second step here just says, is this a membership? If it's not a donation, it's going to check and see if it's a membership. And it's going to look then, is the opportunity type equal to membership? If it is, basically the same thing. It's using a different email alert, which uses a different email template to send that membership email. This is pretty simple. If it's not either of those, the process is going to just continue on to the end, not find anything, and not send an email. If you wanted to add other steps for different types, if you wanted to use different criteria, if you wanted to send a different thank you if the person is flagged as a major donor as opposed to, you know, a new donor, or there are any number of email templates you could choose and criteria you could use. But the other process here, which is just a step in something which is intended to be for all opportunities and take all opportunities. And this one has this big first question of, like, should the acknowledgement be sent? And what I have done here is just basically do a version of the formula that we find in the workflow rule already. This formula here, it's deciding whether the criteria are met. It's the formula evaluating to true. It is basically the same formula as the one that is on the workflow rule. You do have to translate it a little bit. It won't go directly from your workflow rule into the process builder, but it's saying the same thing. You just have to change a little bit how it addresses things, and that is in the blog post, which I'll send you the link to. You can copy and paste exactly this and then edit it if you want to. And what the workflow rule does initially, the thing that's initially set up, it has two actions. It sends the email, which we invoke the process to do, and then there's two field updates. It updates the acknowledgement date and the status of the update. So here I've set it up basically the same thing. To send the email, you start your action node, you say what you want to do is invoke another flow. I forget the exact wording of how that works. And then you select the process, which I showed you the other one, select and send acknowledgement email. And then your process variable, what it wants is an object. You're just going to send it the opportunity that started the whole thing. And then there is a second action step here. Sorry, I'm hitting the wrong keyboard again. And it just does those two field updates. It sets the acknowledgement date and to today, and it sets the status to acknowledged. One weakness I realized is talking through this, I said that the process builder, if the other process, if it doesn't match the record type, it won't send anything. The way this is set up, it's going to mark it as acknowledged. So you would probably want to add something else to the formula to make sure that it's one of the record types that you actually want acknowledged, so it doesn't say it's acknowledged when it didn't actually happen.
Oh, that's a good thing to learn. It's great as you're talking something through that you realize that another thing is needed. I'm very interested in this way that you've linked two processes. Scott. That's
So my argument for that, having said that the best practice says you should have all your opportunity processes on this. I mean, one reason for doing it this way is that the criteria here are pretty complicated, right? And so if you had another step on this for every different variant, you would need to have a fairly complicated formula to maintain. And if you realize that you've added some other field, which like don't send thank you note, you would have to go through and make sure that was added in every step. Here, you just have to maintain that here and then do the different choices about what email you want to send in the other process.
That's great. And when you set up your email acknowledgements process, then is there something slightly different in the way that you start building that? Because I believe is it one of the options when you first choose your when you actually start building the process? Because you have ways that you can choose how the process is fired, don't you? I think.
Right. Let me just do that quickly.
So.
Oh, hitting this wrong keyboard again. So this makes the whole typing in public thing even worse when I have a
It's all right. We know what
keyboard.
send means. It's fine. Yeah.
Right. And then, so starting that.
There's a required field that you have to scroll down to.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, it's this tiny screen that I'm.
Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Yeah, this is the one.
Ah.
So we're saying this is invoked by another process. It's not invoked by record change. It's invoked by another process. So that's saying that we're going to hit it from something else.
That's great. That's an interesting one. That's one of the tips I think a lot of people probably wouldn't have known. And I think it's very interesting the way that you've linked those two things together, because I suppose most people build these as a record changes processes. It's interesting to see it linked in that way.
So that's that. I'll put the link to the blog post with the whole step-by-step and screenshots and stuff in the chat if anyone wants to try it out on their own.
I beat you to it, Scott, because I'd seen it before.
Okay.
So the link is already posted. Feel free if you want to put any follow-up or anything like that. That's great. Does anyone? So somebody's asking, what about that other option, the one in the middle? Can anyone speak to a platform event message is received? Have any of you used that? Does anyone know what it means?
I only know from like doing trailheads, but platform events are pretty in depth, but essentially you can either using Apex, or I think you can now do it actually in ProcessBuilder. You can create a platform event on some criteria. You know, when something happens, a platform event is published, and the point is you have the pub sub model, the publish subscribe model. Platform events get published, something can be out there listening for them and do something when one of them is created. In this case, you could make a process that listens for platform events and fire based on that. The idea is platform events are transient. They don't get stored. You could have millions of them. The place I've seen it is IoT devices might send messages, and you are subscribed to those events, and you only do something when one of those events is important, and the rest just disappear into the past and don't fill up your data storage.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That's great. And thank you, Sandy, for the idea that's come out of the Trailhead module. Yes, if you find that that invoking using is new, that would be great. Find a link to it. Thank you for that. Does anyone have any other questions about what Scott's just been showing us? And we'll move on. But that's great. Thank you for figuring out your devices and the very small keyboard, Scott. And I'm glad you got back on. Okay. Michael, shall we hand over to you? If other questions occur to people, please do post them into the chat. I'm going to hand over to Michael now, and we'll keep going. So Michael, you had something a little different, I think, not necessarily fundraising based.
Well, I'm going to start with I'll go a
Okay.
little quickly so we have some time for questions. I'm going to start with a fundraising based example, which I'm just going to show. Maybe I won't even actually demo it happening, but if you would like to enforce a naming convention, I frequently enforce them on opportunities. You can do that with a process builder. So here I have, and you can see this is a fairly involved process. This is my one opportunity process that does everything. So as to stick with the best practice of one process per object. But I'm just going to focus on the first couple of nodes. So if you want to have a naming convention that's different for different types, for example, here we have enforced the naming convention. First of all, we started doing it after a certain date. And the naming convention is different if the donation is on a contact versus on an account. So if it's on a contact, we're checking to see if the conditions are met. So is this an opportunity after the date we started having a naming convention? Is it on a record type where the account is a household account? And of course, we have a couple other things like that the campaign ID is not null, because in our naming convention, and it's hard to see here, so that's why I'm going to hover here, we're using the campaign name in the naming convention. So every time this opportunity is edited, it will have this naming convention applied, which is pretty simple. It's going to set the name based on a formula, and it's it's a misery to read, but it wasn't so hard to build because you used the field picker. It says the full name of the contact, who was the primary account contact, the campaign, and then the close date. And so you will always ensure that opportunities are named after their, in this case, donor, campaign, and close date. Similarly, for organizations, I have a similar set of criteria, but then the formula for the name is modified for the fact that this is an account donation. So it's going to show the name of the account, not the person. And it's going to, again, show the campaign name and the close date. And you can see that I've actually broken out the close date so that it becomes month, day, year, because if you just use the close date field, you're going to not get the format that you want. So that's pretty simple, I think. And if I show an opportunity, let's see, I'm not on someone who would have given an opportunity. I'll just show you quickly the result of it. You know, here are all my opportunities. They nicely use the name, the campaign, and the date. And if I go into one of those opportunities and I was to try to edit the name to some sort of something that doesn't comply with my naming convention, I have required fields.
Oh, the bane of testing.
The bane of testing. If I try not to give it the right name according to the naming convention, when it saves, thank you live demos, it's going to take forever, it will reapply the naming convention and nothing will have changed if it ever finishes saving. Oh, live demos. There we go. And you can see the name didn't change because it ignored my test name and applied the naming convention again. Of course, you need to make sure that your organization wants those names to always be applied, because as I noted, right, the close date is on here. If I change the close date, the name of the opportunity changes to today's close date or to the new close date. So if people are in the habit of discussing records based on the record name, those names are going to change. But if they're in the habit of knowing that opportunities always meet this naming convention, they shouldn't be confused. If there are questions on that one, I'll take them now. Otherwise, I'm going to move to the other couple use cases and still try to have room for questions.
I think you're good, Michael. Keep going.
Great.
There have been questions, just I don't know if everybody saw, about the email templates that are used in automation, and we're getting confirmation that at the moment you can only use classic email templates in email actions.
Yes, I believe that's the case. Okay, so now I'm going to show an interesting use case. I have an object for enrolling students in programs. It's a custom, I've built a custom object that is a junction object between contact and program. It's called enrollment, and it's a very simple object. It's a contact lookup and an enrollment, or rather a program lookup. But you shouldn't be able to be enrolled duplicatively in a program more than once. Some organizations use campaigns as programs for that reason, but there are pros and cons to that, and in this case we decided we wanted a custom object. So one way to enforce not having duplicates is to give yourself a field that is set as a unique field, and then always fill that field with something that will ensure that you check for uniqueness. So, and you can see I noted what this is for, right? This is not put on the page layout. It's just hidden in the background, and it's going to prevent duplicate enrollments. Here's my process. I've got a process on the enrollment object. It fires whenever a record is created or edited. I have one node, and it fires with no criteria. It always fires. And all it does is it fills that compound key field with the student ID and the program ID. And in this case, I have a space, so it would be human readable if you wanted to. So when a record is created, that compound field gets filled, and if you try to create another record with the same compound key, which you will because this process will have filled it for you, so that is to say same student enrolled in the same program, then you're going to get an error that prevents you from a duplicate enrollment. And that's simply done by having this indexed field. All right, last use case. Again with naming convention.
Sorry, I was just going to say I like that one. I think it's the duplicate key. I've done that with form assembly before to make sure it doesn't create records. I think it's very useful to kind of, you're creating an identity key, a sort of duplicate key. Nice one. Thank you.
Exactly. It's a duplicate. Yep. Okay. Last case, I want to show another naming convention that's not on opportunity, because I think there are use cases that aren't opportunities. So this is a report card object for students. If you want to be able to put in their, we built an object to put in their school data, grades, and attendance. You're going to have one for each student for each year, but you shouldn't have more than one for 1 year for any student. And we do a duplicate key type of thing for that. So here's my process on school report card. Again, when created or edited, I have a naming convention that's going to be applied every single time. No criteria, just execute the actions. And it's simple. It fills the report card name with the student's unique identifier. So in this case, it's called AGID for my client, the AG, the Academy Group. AGID plus space plus school year of the report card, which is a required field on the report card object. So when someone is creating new report cards or importing report cards, they have to fill that field. And now that field will become part of the naming convention. And if we look at Harry Potter's school records, we can see one of his school report cards for school year 20, it was automatically filled with his record ID and the school year. You could do it with name and school year. We decided in this case, we just wanted record ID so that if we were passing around information, we wouldn't be giving student names in some sort of clear text. That is my demo, and I think we still have some time for questions, which was the goal.
Great, thank you. No, that's also a nice one. And it's interesting. It's nice to have something that just creates those kind of unique names without because I mean, I guess you could auto number, but this helps you to sort of figure out what your figure out which record you're looking at and things, isn't it? Than just a
Exactly.
auto number.
We didn't want auto-numbered report cards, for example, because then it's impossible to know which one goes with which kid.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's there you're obviously, yeah, you've got some comments and no specific questions, but since we have got 10 minutes, let's go back to oh well, all right, we've got an interesting one but I want to go back to the question that Maida asked a while ago about debugging, because what we had wanted to do with the last part of the session was to talk a bit about gotchas, things that might not work in your process. So, so maybe we can wrap these up a little bit and talk about some gotchas and also how you might know that where the faults lie. Michael, Michael S., do you want to just start us off? If a process isn't working for you, I mean, what are the sort of things that you look for, and where do you try and kind of troubleshoot?
Thanks. Sure. It sort of depends on the situation, obviously, but the first thing I would usually try to do is, can I report on and find the record that I think should have caused the process to fire? So just using regular old reports, can I make a filter or something to go find the record that I think should fire, but that isn't? That's an easy step one. After that, that's actually a really good reason sometimes to do a post to chatter, where it's not actually updating a record, it's not sending an email to somebody, but you could just post to chatter and mention yourself to test, is the condition itself not firing, or is it something wrong with my action itself? Those are two ideas. Michael K. or Scott?
Well, I was going to use that same idea. I often build a version of a process where I post to chatter for each node, and maybe even build a node for the negative condition and post that. And and then play with and of course, better to be doing this in the sandbox, but sure. Sometimes you end up having to do it in production if your process isn't working. Posting to chatter is a great way to monitor the steps.
Yeah.
Another thing that I'll do sometimes, oh, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead, Scott.
Is just, for testing purposes, just limit the process builder in the criteria to a single record. So I'll put a filter on the opportunity ID. So if I'm in production, and if it has potentially wide-ranging consequences if it misfires, here's my test donation, and the ID of this test donation is this, and this process, until it's ready to go live, is only going to work on this one single thing. So you can go in and change the criteria again and again, and not worry that if somebody else externally or internally makes a change to a record, that your process is then going to make something happen that you may not want to happen.
That's a really good idea.
You just got to remember to take it off when you go live.
That you do.
Not working. Why is it not working? Oh, another huge, why is it not working? Why is it not working? And it doesn't happen as much anymore because Lightning uses the 18-digit IDs, 18-character IDs, is process builder criteria will always fail with a 15-digit ID. And you can spend a lot of time comparing the 15 characters to each other and say, this is it. Why isn't it working? It's got to be 18.
That is another excellent tip.
Getting into the gotchas just a little bit, the other thing to think about is there primary or key criteria that's referencing an update on a related record instead of
that's a real gotcha.
The record that you're on? Or is there primary or key criteria that's referencing a formula field that quote unquote changes because something else changed, but a formula field changing is not an edit and save of the record. And so that can never execute automation. So I'm talking about a formula field on the object, not a formula in the criteria itself.
And how do you get around that, Michael? What sort of workarounds do you use?
I mean, an easy relative, but is to whatever your formula field is doing, actually pull that into a process and have that field change based on an edit and save of the record instead of a formula. Other thoughts?
I think sometimes I've seen tricks that you can have like a checkbox field on the object which is changed which changes based on the change on the relative object. Have you ever done any of those sorts of things as well?
Yeah, yep, exactly. Like there's one that I built and demoed for one of our circles years ago where for volunteer hours in the Volunteers for Salesforce setup, we put a checkbox on the volunteer job to say, mark all confirmed people as having completed. And then when that box is checked, there's automation to go check a box on all of the related volunteer hours records. Maybe I'm thinking about this wrong. It's hard to think about a use case when I'm not looking at it. But definitely, I've done something like that.
Yeah, and I think I've seen them of sort of, you have a checkbox like if an opportunity changes, that checks something on the account or vice versa. And I think, yes, thank you. Akash is thank you for joining us from India. Is also suggesting that that can be a useful way to make it to work. Any other good workarounds or gotchas or things, either Michael or Scott, things that you kind of look out for or think about when you're building processes?
Well, this I think is a good place to address the question about the difference between Process Builder and Flow.
Sure.
There isn't a great line, which is why Salesforce is moving towards unifying them. Process Builder is Flow under the hood. I try to think of Process Builder like a trigger, which is that Process Builder looks to see if a record changes and then kicks off what would be in Apex terms a helper class. And that Flow would be the helper class. Of course, Process Builder can do some of the things that would be kicked off, and so it's much simpler to just do them in there. But if you have any sort of logic where you need to look things up or check a bunch of criteria, or like you saw my opportunity process that had like 27 nodes, it would probably be better to kick that into a flow and run all that logic in the flow, except that Process Builder was built by accretion and each node was just a simple addition and it never made sense to rebuild it as a flow. When when the two of them are fully unified, I think there will be a little more idea of like what starts the automation and then what does the automation do is the separate thing.
That's great, thank you. Does anyone want to try and explain recursion for Bob? He's asked a couple of times what recursion is in process.
I can explain what it is, but he asked for a useful use case.
Yeah. There we go.
That's the hard part.
What it is essentially once you've worked through your process builder, if anything in the process made a change that would fire a process had it been the change that was made in the first place, the process starts again. I am terrified of turning on the recursion option because things will fail and I'm never 100% clear on how that loop is going to work and when I'm going to break things.
Yeah, I agree. I would need to go hunt and see. I don't think any of our actual production processes are using recursion at all. It's one of those things to really shy away from unless you really know why you need it. And honestly, it might even be That's probably all I'll say about that.
I mean, I think if you think you have a use case where recursion is needed, you know, a field has changed, and because a field has changed, maybe the process needs to start again. To me, it's like red flag. You should probably be doing this in Flow.
I also haven't used it. I was recently wondering if it would have, if I had a case when it would be useful, but I think I would have a really hard time explaining that train of thought, and I have not yet decided whether the answer is yes or no. So it is, yeah, it does seem to have that potential to be a sorcerer's apprentice kind of situation.
Yeah, and I definitely
suddenly have all these things going on and you've got no control over it.
Exactly. And what I've heard in some sessions is folks just, well, it's not working, so I'll just turn on recursion and see if that makes it work. And that's definitely not what you want to do. Very dangerous to go down that road. So.
Fabulous. That's a great note of caution on which to end. Yes, don't heavy dragons, indeed. Great. We have reached the hour, and we got through the whole agenda. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for some great and concise and informative demos. I've learned a whole bunch of things as well in this session, so I'm sure everybody else does. As I say, I was recording it. Hopefully, if the GoToMeeting dragons are also cooperating now, this recording, I'll be posting it in the Power of Us Hub. So thank you again. Thank you very much to our panel. Thank you to the two Michaels. Thank you to Scott for persisting to get online and to be able to join us. Thank you all of you to join. At some point today, we were up to about 50 of you on the session, which is great. That's a really good turnout. So I'm very grateful. And Office Hours will be back with just a regular Q&A session next week. So in the meantime, stay safe, everybody, stay healthy, and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Caroline.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline.